I walked into that hospital room expecting to feel rage. What I felt instead stopped me cold in the doorway, and I stood there long enough that a nurse asked if I needed help. I didn't know how to answer that. I'm not sure I know even now. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years working for the same civil engineering firm in Columbus, Ohio, and I thought I understood my life. I thought I had a handle on who I was, who my wife was, and what our marriage meant. I was wrong about all three. Her name was Judith. We met when I was 26, at a work function neither of us wanted to attend. She was there with a friend. I was there because my supervisor guilted me into it, and we ended up standing near the same table of mediocre appetizers for an hour, talking about everything except the event itself. I drove her home. She invited me in for coffee. I stayed until 2 in the morning, and I called her the next day. We got married 18 months later in a small ceremony outside Dayton, where her parents lived. Her mother cried. My father shook my hand and said quietly that he hoped I knew what I was doing. I told him I did. I was 27 years old, and I thought certainty was something you could just decide to have. The early years were good. Not perfect, nothing is, but genuinely good. We bought a house in Worthington. We had a dog, a yellow lab named Chester, who chewed through 2 couches and 3 pairs of my shoes before settling into old age with the dignity he had never shown in his youth. Judith worked in hospital administration. I managed infrastructure projects. We had dinner parties and neighborhood block parties and all the ordinary furniture of a life that is quietly working the way it's supposed to. We tried for children for 4 years. 4 years of temperature charts and doctor appointments and hope that arrived every month and left the same way. At some point, the trying became its own kind of grief, and we stopped talking about it the way you stop touching a bruise, not because it's healed, but because you've accepted that pressing on it will only hurt. Eventually, we stopped trying altogether. We adjusted. We traveled more. We put more into the house. We told ourselves we were fine, and mostly we believed it, and mostly it was true. What I didn't know, what I had no reason to suspect, was that during the 2nd year of our marriage, before the infertility had been formally identified, before the doctors and the charts, Judith had been pregnant. She had been pregnant, and she had not told me. I found out about my son the same way, I imagine. Most men find out about things they were never meant to know, by accident, in a moment of ordinary life. When the information falls out of somewhere, it had been hidden and lands in front of you before anyone can put it back. It was a Thursday evening in February. Judith was at a conference in Cincinnati. I was home, eating leftover pasta and watching a college basketball game I didn't particularly care about, when her email notification came up on the laptop we shared. We shared it because her personal computer had died 2 weeks earlier and her replacement hadn't arrived yet. I wasn't snooping. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't looking for anything. The subject line said, everything you told me. I don't know what made me click on it. Something in those 4 words. I opened the thread and I read it, and then I read it again, and then I sat on the couch for a long time without moving. The emails went back 6 months. The man's name was Connor. They had been meeting when she traveled for work, which she did 4 or 5 times a year. The emails were not ambiguous. They were not the kind of thing you could explain away. But that wasn't what stopped me. What stopped me was a single line, buried in an email from 3 months earlier, where she wrote to him, "You know I've never told anyone, not even him. I have to live with that." He had written back asking what she meant. She had written, "Before we got married, I was already showing a little, just enough that I knew I had to do something. I went to my cousin Patricia's house in Indianapolis for 6 weeks and told him I was helping her recover from surgery. The baby was born and I gave him up. I never told anyone. I was 23. I didn't know what else to do. I sat with that for 4 hours. I didn't eat. I didn't watch anything. Chester had been gone for years by then, and the house was very quiet. When Judith came home from Cincinnati 2 days later, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the laptop open. She saw my face before she saw the screen. She set her bag down slowly. How long? I asked. She didn't ask what I meant. She sat down across from me. She looked at her hands. She told me everything, in pieces, over the next 2 hours, about the pregnancy she hid from her parents and from me, about the 6 weeks in Indianapolis, about a boy born in late October of 1994, placed through a private adoption agency, given to a family whose last name she had never known. She had been 23. She was afraid I would leave her if I found out. She was afraid of everything, she said. She was 23. I understood that, intellectually. But understanding something and being able to hold it are different things. I asked about Connor. She cried. She told me it had been going on for 2 years. I slept in the guest room that night and the night after. On the third day, I called a lawyer. Within 6 months, we were divorced. The paperwork finalized in October. I moved into an apartment in Clintonville. I went to work and came home and cooked for myself and tried to understand what the shape of my life was now. At 56 years old, living alone for the first time since my late 20s. My friends were kind. My sister called every Sunday. My supervisor gave me the easier assignments for a few months without making a point of it, which was the most tactful thing anyone did for me. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Okafor. She did not tell me what to feel. She asked questions and waited. I liked that about her. One evening, about 8 months after the divorce, I was at my sister's house for dinner, and her son, my nephew, 19, who has the attention span of a golden retriever and the heart of someone twice his age, was showing me something on his phone, an app for genealogy. He had been doing one of those DNA testing things for a history class, and he was excited about it. He pulled up his results and explained them to me for 15 minutes while my sister's husband made fun of him from across the table. On the drive home, I thought about it. I ordered the kit 2 days later. I'm not sure what I was expecting. I told myself I was curious about my own heritage. My father's family was from western Pennsylvania, coal country, and nobody had ever talked much about before that, but that wasn't really why. My results came back 5 weeks later. I looked at the ancestry percentages for a few minutes, and then I looked at the DNA matches. The second match on the list was someone I didn't recognize. Not a distant relative, not a fourth cousin twice removed. The estimated relationship said, close family, parent/child or sibling. His username was just initials. His profile was mostly private, but there was a small public section, and in it he had written, adoptee, looking for biological family, born October 1994, Indianapolis area. I sat at my kitchen table for a very long time. He had found the match too. He messaged me first 2 days later, carefully. He said he wasn't sure what he was looking at, but he wanted to reach out. He said he hoped this wasn't strange. He said his name was Brennan. I stared at that name for a long time. I wrote back. I told him I had recently learned some things about my family history that I hadn't known before. I told him I was open to talking. I did not tell him what I knew. I did not tell him that the match he was looking at was his biological father, and that I had only just learned he existed, and that I was still figuring out what any of this meant. We emailed for 3 weeks. He was 29. He had grown up in a suburb of Indianapolis with a family who loved him. He was clear about that. Made a point of saying it, the way people do when they want you to know they're not damaged by what happened to them, or at least not in the ways you'd assume. He had 2 younger siblings, both also adopted. His father was a high school basketball coach. His mother taught elementary school. He had grown up going to church on Sundays and camping in the summers and doing all the things that suggest a childhood that was cared for. He worked in landscape architecture. He had been married for 3 years. He told me, carefully, that he and his wife had recently had a son. I had a grandson I had never met. I asked how he had come to do the DNA test. He said his wife had encouraged it. She wanted to know more about the medical history on his biological side. There were things you just couldn't know, she had said, without knowing where you came from. He said he agreed with her, but also that he had always been a little curious. He said he wasn't looking for anything other than information, really. He hoped that was okay. I told him that was more than okay. He sent me a photo at some point, just a casual one. Him at a cookout, holding a baby who had his ears and apparently my father's eyebrows. I looked at that photo for a long time. I thought about my father shaking my hand on my wedding day and saying he hoped I knew what I was doing. I thought about how none of us ever really know. We had been exchanging messages for almost a month when he mentioned, in passing, that he had recently been hospitalized. He was careful about the way he said it. Not alarming, just matter of fact. A heart issue that had shown up suddenly in his late 20s. He'd had a procedure done. He was fine now, recovering at home, but it had been serious enough that his doctors wanted to know more about his family history, specifically cardiac history. Was there anything on the biological side I could tell him? I realized I didn't know. I thought about my father, who had died of a heart attack at 64. I thought about my mother's side, one uncle who'd had bypass surgery in his 50s. I told him what I knew. I told him I thought he deserved to know more than that. I drove to Indianapolis on a Saturday morning in April. It was raining when I left Columbus and sunny by the time I got to the Indiana state line, and I drove through that change in weather thinking about all the things I had planned to say, and whether any of them were right. He lived in a suburb called Carmel, in a house on a quiet street with a large backyard he had landscaped himself. There was a tire swing. His wife met me at the door. She was warm and a little cautious in the way that people are when they're protecting someone they love. She offered me coffee. She brought the baby in and then took him back out when he got fussy. And Brennan and I sat across from each other at a kitchen table that looked a lot like mine. He looked like me, not dramatically, not in a way that would make a stranger stop and stare, but in the way that's undeniable once you're sitting close enough. The set of the jaw, something around the eyes. He held his coffee mug with both hands the way I do when I'm thinking. We talked for 4 hours. I told him everything. I told him about Judith, about the emails, about the 6 weeks in Indianapolis she had told me about. I told him that I had not known he existed until 8 months ago. I told him about the DNA kit and the match, and the 2 days I spent deciding whether to respond to his message. He was quiet for a long time after I finished. Then he said, "She never told you at all." "No," I said, "she didn't." He looked at the table. He looked at the window. He looked like a man processing something he'd been carrying at a distance for a long time and was now being asked to hold up close. He said, "My parents told me when I was old enough that my birth mother had been very young and hadn't been in a position to raise a child. They were kind about it. They never said anything bad about her." He paused. "I think I always assumed my birth father just didn't know about me. I didn't know if that was true. But I hoped it was." "It was true," I said. "I promise you that." He nodded slowly. His wife came back in then, without the baby, and she sat beside him and put her hand over his on the table. She looked at me with an expression I will not easily forget. Not accusation, not gratitude exactly, just something clear and steady that said, "I see what this is costing all of you." Before I left, he asked if I would come back. He said he wasn't sure what he was asking for exactly. He wasn't looking to replace anything or disrupt anything. He had a father. He had a family. But he thought maybe there was something here worth getting to know. I told him I thought so too. I drove home in the early evening through the same stretch of Indiana farmland I had driven through that morning, and I thought about Judith. Not with anger. I had spent a lot of time being angry, and it had not added anything useful to my life. I thought about her at 23, terrified, making a decision that she would carry alone for 36 years. I thought about what it costs a person to carry something like that. I thought about whether I would have done differently at 23 if the positions had been reversed, and I found that I was not as certain as I would have liked. I'm not defending her. What she did caused real harm to Brennan, who grew up without the medical history he deserved to know, who spent years wondering. To me, who spent 30 years in a marriage built on something hidden. You can understand a choice without excusing it, but I've also learned in the past year that forgiveness is not really about the other person. It's about what you decide to carry and what you put down. When I got home, I sat at my kitchen table and I opened my email. There was already a message from Brennan. Short, It just said, "My wife says you have my grandfather's eyebrows. She looked up pictures of him online after you left. She wanted you to know she thinks it's a strong look." I laughed. Genuinely, completely. For the first time in a long time, I wrote back, "Tell her I'll pass along the compliment when I see him next." The next morning, I drafted a long letter, something I had been writing in my head for weeks. Not to Judith, to my son, about who I was, what my family came from, the grandfather who had coal dust in his lungs by 30 and still lived to 71, about my father's heart, about the yellow lab and the bad couch decisions, about who I had been at 27, standing at a table of mediocre appetizers, talking to a woman for an hour, not knowing what was already in motion. I told him I was sorry it took this long. I told him I hope that what comes next is better than what was lost. I pressed send before I could think about it too much. His reply came 2 hours later. It said, "I'd like my son to know his grandfather. Whatever that looks like for you." I read it twice. Then I got up, washed my breakfast dishes, and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the yard that needs work every spring and always will, thinking about tire swings and men I haven't met yet, and the strange, specific mercy of arriving somewhere true, even when the road there was wrong. I used to think that the hardest thing a person could face was betrayal. Finding out that someone you loved had been lying to you, that the life you thought you were living had a different story running underneath it the whole time. I thought that was the worst of it. I was wrong. The hardest thing isn't the betrayal. It's what you do with yourself after. Who you decide to be when the version of your life you believed in is gone and you're standing in the wreckage trying to figure out what's still worth keeping. Judith made choices that hurt people. She hurt Brennan, who grew up without a medical history, without answers, without even knowing there was a question to ask. She hurt me, 30 years of a marriage that had something buried underneath it the whole time. The harm was real. I don't soften that, but I spent a long time being angry about what she did, and I noticed something. The anger didn't build anything. It didn't give Brennan back the years he spent wondering. It didn't give me back the mornings I sat across a breakfast table from a woman I thought I fully knew. The anger was honest, but it had no future in it. At some point you have to ask yourself, am I holding this because it's helping me, or because letting it go feels like saying it didn't matter? It mattered, and I let it go anyway. Those two things can both be true. What I learned, and I mean really learned, not the kind of thing you nod at in a therapist's office, but the kind that lands in your chest at 6 in the morning when you're standing at a kitchen window, is that cause and consequence are not always punishment. Sometimes they're just information. Judith hid what she did because she was afraid, and fear compounded into 30 years of silence, and that silence eventually collapsed on its own weight, not as justice, just as the natural result of what happens when something true keeps getting covered over. It finds a way out. It always does. The part that required real courage, from me and from Brennan, was deciding what to do once it was out. He could have closed the door. He had every right to. He had a full life, a father who coached his teams, a mother who helped with his homework. He didn't need me, but he left the door open anyway, and I think that took more strength than most people will ever have to show, because it meant being willing to feel something complicated without knowing how it would end. That's what I think about now when I talk about what this cost. Not the anger, not the grief, though those were real and I earned them, but the question of whether I was going to let what happened to me determine what kind of man I still had in front of me to be. I was 58 years old. I had a grandson I had never met. I had a son who held his coffee mug with both hands when he was thinking, the same way I do. Some things you lose you don't get back. But some things you find are worth more than what you were looking for.